Recording is on.
Good morning, everybody. It's Sunday, November the 7th, and this is the Eastern Extinctionati meeting. Okay, so for today, since Ryan is here, I think we should carry on with the AI discussion because I was enjoying that. I hope other people were. Does anybody have anything else to say before we start, or does anybody want a different subject? Anybody bored with this one? Or does anybody want us to take it in a new direction, or are we doing okay for what we discussed so far?
Or if there are any terms or anything that we glossed over that were creating confusion that we should identify.
Oh, thank you. Yes, no, I'm not like you, knowledgeable in computing, but I've looked up the terms that you used, and I've tried to understand a bit what you're talking about. So I'm okay personally. There might be other.
Okay, yeah. We'll try to do better. I'll try to do better. He does a pretty good job, but we'll stop us if there's anything that that gets confusing.
Okay.
Yeah, I like to use like analogies, and I always think that if it's that thing if you can't I can't remember who said it, some physicist said if you can't really explain your theory to grandma, you don't actually probably understand it yourself. So I think all good theories should be able to be explained without jargon and without getting too technical. So long yeah. How do I use now as 100 million registered employees? Yeah. Oh, okay. So let's if we carry on. If we carry on the same line of discussion. So just to recap where I was going with this, and just to level set again, is that we're in the pursuit of what is intelligence. And the reason why I think it's valuable is that I don't think artificial intelligence is going to solve all the world's problems. In fact, it's going to create a lot more than it solves. But it's useful for us to see ourselves. So it's a useful tool for our own enlightenment. And I think that that's where we'll get to if we just nail down what intelligence is. So what I'm slowly intelligence really is. So going back to the last discussion we had, I was proposing this thing that, well, let's take, for instance, what stupidity is. Okay, so first, as a kind of counter argument to stalk intelligence. So then I said basically, if something's completely random and you have a random number generator, you have to say, well, this is stupid, because whatever you interrogate it with in a kind of Turing test, it comes up with garbage. And so you can clearly say, well, this is not very intelligent. On the other hand, if something's too consistent, and if you say, she loves you not, she loves you not, she loves you, you're always going to get she loves you not out of this machine. Then you can assume that it's not very bright if that's all it puts out. Now, according to Gregory Chaitin, and I like this idea, is that you cannot really tell whether something's random unless you actually look at the mechanism that generates it. So what we're doing with AI is we're continually making the mistake of looking at the output and saying it's intelligent. And I don't think it is, not even close. But it's fooling us, particularly because it's appealing to our alien cortex. And so it's not To actually tell whether it's intelligent, you have to lift up the hood and see the mechanism that generated it. So if you lifted up the hood of, say, a machine and then said, you know, you can't do a Turing test. Turing test is bunk, because the Turing test presupposes that you can tell from the output what intelligence is. And I'm saying, no, you can't, just like you can't tell what randomness is. That's my argument. So say if you lift up the hood of this machine that was supposedly artificially intelligent, you would perhaps say, for hypothetically, you would have an example where, oh, you say, okay, I see what they did. They got random noise out of the universe, just put it through a lexical grinder and popped out an answer. So it's saying, well, this is not intelligent. You could tell that straight away from first principles. Then if you had another machine that says, you know, whatever the input is, just print out, she loves you not. And you say, whatever you say, she loves me not. That's all you're going to get. It's just a simple loop program that puts out one. And you can also say, well, that's too consistent. It's too predictable to be intelligent. So then intelligence must lie somewhere between these two, and I'd say on the edge of chaos, unless it's on a boundary condition between these two. So then what exactly is it, and why does AI not is just approximate it or mimic it, but not actually achieve it? And never will, in fact, is one of my predictions, if you agree with all this eventual argument. But I'll get to what I think intelligence is. But the first thing I wanted to say in this one is I would propose that taking the model that we had before is like, where the departure point for intelligence is our intelligence. So you have to say that the benchmark is the human brain, and we're trying to mimic the human brain. We kind of say, well, what the human brain does is just a specific instance of some kind of capability called intelligence. And so, you know, the idea is that intelligence is an emergent feature of our brains, but it exists in an abstract form, and somehow we can know it. I don't think so. I think that it's the other way around. It's basically intelligence leads to the human brain. So it's kind of, we've got everything upside down. But okay, so then I will also say that if you take the human brain as a departure point for intelligence, then you would have to say, if your mechanism that you are claiming is artificially intelligent generates intelligence, you would also expect it to generate the things, the artifacts that humans do. For example, it should be able to go on a psychedelic trip. It should be able to, you know, have epilepsy, psychosis, all these kind of things. You would at least you know, have to model them. There is things like neurosis. I mentioned that Theseus the mouse, Claude Shannon's mechanical mouse that winds through the maze, they found that it could easily get into a loop, a fixed loop that the psychologists in the Macy Foundation, they immediately said that you've mimicked a human neurosis. And I think that is. So it's human neurosis is a loop that you just can't get out of. You get stuck in a never-ending cycle of loop. And I think that's a good model for neurosis. So you're going to mimic a neurosis, and you say, well, okay, what about something like an acid trip or a psychedelic trip? And what would that even look like in a machine? Well, I posted that little video there on ExxonMed of this acid trip in a supermarket. This guy generated this acid trip. Now, he didn't say how he did it, but I mean, again, you know, if you look under the hood and look at the mechanism, I think where he got that from, I strongly suspect he got that from Google. So what happened at Google is they looked at the image recognition system, and they wanted to know what it's really seeing. If you just give it a reel of video footage, like, you know, a normal shopping trip through a supermarket, what does it actually see? And they were amazed to see that it's looking at things like, you know, a T-shirt of somebody walking past, and then they say, oh, that's the head of a puppy, and it looks at, you know, boxes of cereal up in the shelves there, and maybe because they have Tony the Tiger or something, but suddenly you got a row of tigers' faces, and it looks strangely like an acid trip. So I think we should go into exactly what an acid trip is, why humans are having them. So if you lift the hood on humans and you say, what's happening with an acid trip, and would it be possible even for AI to have the same kind of experience? So, and also from that, hopefully we can get to like the qualia and the sensation. So we, again, I think we have it upside down, that we think if things get complex enough, then we get to consciousness and feelings and qualia. Qualia is things like the redness. When you look at something red, if you're not colorblind, it looks so damn red as opposed to green. And when you feel sick, you feel very sick. And all those kind of feelings, it's hard to imagine how a machine feels them, but they assume, oh, well, like the movie AI, if you make it complex enough, eventually it'll stop doing that. No, it's the other way around. The qualia come first, all the feeling. If you look in the evolutionary tree, you can see the neural apparatus is building up from the bits like the amygdala, the limbic system, the bits of the feeling things, the fish brain. So I think, and I mean, I spend a lot of time interacting with fish these days, I think the fish are full of qualia. It's possible to imagine being a fish or being a slug or something, and it's just raw feelings. It's kind of the opposite of being in a dream. Often dreams are not so feeling. If you just imagine raw emotions of smell, you just imagine a continuous stream of like a coffee smell, a feeling of anxiety, the taste of honey, just a sound, and just imagine a continuous stream without any thoughts, without any words. That's the fish's world. Its whole body is an ear, so it's all just feelings. So I think that disturbs people a lot, because they like to think, that animals are dumb, and it's only when you get to be human that you start to feel. And I think that's the justification for the RSPCA and cruelty to animals, is they're all feeling. They're just feeling toned all the way up. And really, by the time you get to humans, with less feeling. I mean, by the time you get to a psychopath, they're all in the alien cortex, and that's what they're noted for, is anhedonia, those kind of dampening feelings. So okay. So now, if you say, okay, now what's actually going on with an acid trip? So if you look at all these neurotransmitters, DMT and psilocybin and MDMA and LSD, all these things, and what they do, they have a rough idea of what they do, but you can guess. And they all mainly mess with the serotonin receptors. So why does that give you an acid trip? And the reason is that first of all, they used to think they were excitatory. So they thought that they excited your neurons and made it kind of the junctions easier to bridge, so that your synapses had less activation potential. So in other words, your brain was getting more hysterical. It is kind of like that, because qualitatively, people who have in psychosis, or if they're on an LSD trip, or they resemble somebody in panic. They make snap judgments. In other words, you see Tony the Tiger on the cereal packet, and you start to see tigers and weird things, and it's easy to see that in that aroused state, it must have evolved, because it's showing you everything. It's got the volume turned up on all the pattern recognition, and it's easy to see, well, for an animal in the jungle like us, a primate, false positives are cheap. If you see a tiger and it isn't a tiger, it's just leaves, that's kind of safe. But if you see a tiger and you think, oh, it's just leaves, well, that's a false negative that's really, really has bad consequences. So as a result, when we're in an aroused state, if we're walking through the graveyard, we're whistling through the graveyard, we start to see shapes everywhere, and tombstones seem to have faces. I can't remember what you call it when you see faces that aren't there.
Pareidolia, I think.
Pareidolia, that's the one. Yeah. So So again, if you see, pareidolia and you see the face on Mars, then everybody gets excited because they say, well, that's, an example of aliens. But again, it's the output. You have to ask what created that face on Mars, and you say, well, it's weathering, and weathering is a random process. There's no evidence for tooling or machine or designing or anything like that. So you would say the process that made it was unintelligent, and the output fools you into thinking it's intelligent because it looks like a face, but that intelligence is really in you. So going back to an acid trip, when you see faces, you have pareidolia and stuff all over the place. Easy to make up a story for we evolved to do that because it's a heightened situation, it's a dangerous situation, and then you should be in panic. So you see that the limbic system is probably making all these serotonin adaptations to say, we're in deep shit here, you better be hyper alert. And then that hyper alert creates visual hallucinations and things like that. So it seems like from the Google example that AI can do those kind of hallucinations. It seems like the pattern recognition and image recognition can hallucinate in a certain extent. So, but why does it qualitatively seem different? The reason for a person, especially on an LSD trip, it seems like the realest thing known to man. And why isn't everybody in a normal waking state? When you go into the supermarket, why don't you see an acid trip like somebody who on an LSD trip or in psychosis or in panic would start to see all tigers and stuff on the shelf in the supermarket? And so what they found is that it's not all excitatory. So when they look at the neurons, some of them are actually inhibitory. In fact, most neurons are actually inhibitory. So what happens is they detected, all the neurons are getting excited, but some of them were getting excited, and the net result, the cascade that they caused, was actually inhibitory to most of them. So then you say, well, when I walk through the supermarket, are there parts of my brain that sees tigers and puppies' faces on T-shirts and it's all being suppressed? And say, well, not really. And I don't think so. And I have to go into some explanation to say, and I think it's worthwhile going into this explanation because it'll start to unfold it maybe a little bit more about what intelligence is. So how is it possible that you don't have tigers and things being represented by parts of your brain and other parts of your brain to say, shut up, we're in a supermarket. It's like those are not tigers. And you can happily go and shop without, getting put in a white jacket. So I think the reason is, okay, what they found is that the dampening effect is on I think it's called the anterior cingulate gyrus. But anyway, it's a big junction. It's kind of like, imagine a railway junction. So it's a very important hub in all the connectome in your brain. And it is, I keep on going on about the COP thing, not the COP26, but the COP in your brain. There's always this COP. And I mentioned that, in the cult thing that I was in, just when you're about to have this, amazing shared intersubjective LSD trip experience, this big trip, then there's always this COP that comes in and shuts it down. And that COP, I think, is located in your anterior cingulate gyrus. I hope I got the right module. But anyway, it's a well-known exchange. It's kind of, they think of it kind of like an executive module. So it's kind of like a traffic cop, or otherwise maybe somebody that directs traffic, or an executive in a company. So that you imagine a general on a battlefield gets a lot of information. The general decides which is important and then suppresses some messages and propagates others. You remember my mentor, Tom, was like really wired into the global network of, movers and shakers. And I said, his more active role was suppression of things. So basically, he would get lots of ideas and information and just tons of people talking to him, influential people. And he had so many people that listened to him and took his advice. And if he said something, had a lot of impact. So he had to be careful what he said and what he propagated. So if you come to him with a story of, hey, cold fusion is the next thing, he wouldn't go and run around telling everybody, oh, cold fusion is the next thing, or AI is the next thing. He would sit on it, and he told me that, he would sit on until he heard it, something from 3 credible sources. He wouldn't start to propagate it. And I said to him, I noticed looking at him, I said that the bigger effect that he has, he thought his effect was what he propagated. And I said to him, no, actually, it's what you suppress is the bigger effect that you have on the world as a network node, as this preferential network node in the world society. And so he thought about it for a bit and came back and he said, I was right. He thinks that. And I think it's the same with this, anterior singular gyre. The COP makes it seemingly intelligent, makes the human brain seem intelligent, because it's making a salience landscape by filtering out all these erroneous things. Now, how does that happen? Where does the smarts to do it? It comes from context. So in other words, imagine something like this. If you look at that video of the acid trip in the supermarket, you can clearly see the machine is looking at a t-shirt and going, oh, that's a puppy face, because it's been trained to recognize animals. Now, the singular gyrus wouldn't allow us to do it because it says, we're in a supermarket. We can see that that's a pair of jeans, correctly identified. And so then, as soon as we're in the territory of jeans, we assume t-shirt. So therefore, it's a human wearing jeans and t-shirt. And we know that, if you're in jeans and t-shirt, you suppress the puppy face or the tiger or whatever thing, because it's like, clearly we're not in that context. And so that's what it's doing, I think, in terms of a junction of, allowing messages through and suppressing others. And so the machine doesn't have, the AI, like image recognition, it doesn't have that context. It's not modal. It just has puppy images, and it has no context. It never says, hey, what is the chance of a tiger appearing in the supermarket shelf other than as Tony the Tiger on the cereal packet? It's like, it's zero chance of a tiger. But now when you're on an acid trip, suddenly you apparently lose context, and you start to see tigers and shit on the, in the patterns in the supermarket and shelf where they just clearly are. So you say, well, how is this? And then I said this before, and I'll go over it again because it's important. But now, before I go over this, I would definitely not want to help anybody. If you're listening to this and you program artificial intelligence or supervised or unsupervised learning machines or anything like that, is like, if you use what I'm telling you, I swear I'll hunt you down and kill you. So I'm not telling you this to improve AI. I think AI is a plague, and I definitely don't want to help anybody. But if you wanted to make better AI, the way to make it, the way to do it is to make it multimodal and make it more like our brain. So what is our brain doing? And I've said this before, that it's in this context. So what makes it so powerful is combinatorics. So imagine this. Say in AI, you normally have this kind of feed-forward neural mesh network. And it really only has weighted nodes, and that's how it works. It says, what's my... And they have the model of the human brain also. They think of it like that. They think, well, it's kind of like a transistor. If it has all these actions and inputs, then it has an activation potential and a weight, and if the weight is exceeded, bang, it goes and propagates the signal. And it's like, no, I don't think that's what it's doing at all. Sorry, neurologists. What it's doing is more like this. Imagine you could do this in software. It's not difficult. Is you would have what's called global variables. So in other words, in each neural node in the network would have reference to, say, let's say 10 global variables. Now, what are those global variables? the way to see them is in biology is they're the concentrations of those neurotransmitters. So there are various neurotransmitters that are changing the action potential of the neurons. For example, you get particularly things like dopamine and glutamate, and all the things like cortisol and estrogens and all of these hormones and chemicals, and it's a big chemical soup. But all of them have a certain kind of concentration. Now, if you imagine, say, an artificial intelligence, you say, okay, well, they've got 10 neurotransmitters, and all of these neurons you simulate there in a soup. In other words, you just have global variables that have various concentrations of these hypothetical chemicals. Now, what happens is it makes the neurons extremely smart, because they don't just say, okay, what's my input potential and weight, and do I propagate the signal or not? They say, based on the combinations of the neurotransmitter. So in other words, think of it like this. The neuron gets an input signal and says, oh, I think I'm about to fire. But it goes and says, but I must check. Is like, what's the serotonin level? What's the dopamine? What's the glutamate? And it's only, say, is it one of my magic keys? And so it would have, states where it would say just that combination of chemicals and neurotransmitters means that I fire if all else is good. Then you might have 5 or 6 more, and they say, then those would also be conditions for it to fire. Now, if you have a look at the combinatorics of those 10 neurotransmitters and say each one of their concentrations is extremely important, you will find that there's a combinatorial explosion that makes each individual neuron massively, massively complex. And the reason is that it's multimodal, so it has a lot more conditions for whether it fires, and once it's fired, it also says when it can fire again. So it says and then the other trick is it's not only excitatory, it's also inhibitory. So you have all these huge conditions. You have whether the inhibitory, and then you also have this, it's very conditional on exactly what neurotransmitters are there. So it's like, is there any kind of proof for this? Yeah, I think, there's plenty of proof. Well, you imagine this. So surely you've had this experience where you've gone out to the pub and you have like 10 beers or something, and everybody's telling jokes and you're all having a great old time. Remember, the next day you cannot remember a single one of those jokes. Why? Because you no longer have that level of alcohol. So the alcohol is changing the action potential. So, but in some mode, your brain has wired together with a Hebbian response. So, what fires together wires together. But the wiring together, although superficially it might look like the connectome is wired together for all modes, it's not really. It's wired together for 10 alcohol, 10 beer level wiring, if you see what I mean. So then when you sober the next morning, you can't remember a single joke, but what happened that evening. But have 10 beers again, and suddenly it all comes back to you. Suddenly you can remember all the jokes, you can remember what people said, you're kind of back in this new realm. The same thing happens to you with LSD. So in other words, heightened stimulus and high stimulus environment puts you back into where the state you were when you actually had this memory formation. So in other words, if you get into heightened memory states, then you start to see tigers because they wind up in evolution even for that level of cortisol and adrenaline and all of these things that put it in that mode. But when you get into a new level of different combinatorics of concentrations of the neurotransmitters, then you're in a whole new world. And so then you might not be able to remember what happened to you when you walked through the graveyard. You might have a traumatic event, and then they say, oh, well, you have a suppressed memory. No, you have an inaccessible memory. You probably can access that memory again if you get into that state again. And there are plenty of examples of this. I don't think it's too out there as a theory. So then what happens to the normal person when they go to a supermarket is they're putting themselves in a, they're going on the shopping trip. They immediately in this mode, a habitual mode, they have a certain level of dopamine. It's a lot of, the reason why they get into those levels of neurotransmitters is because of past habit and association. So when you first go to the supermarket, you probably go with your mom, and you have, it's kind of exciting, and you probably have a bit of dopamine, and, there's an expectation of reward and things like that. So you have a kind of level set of these neurotransmitters. That's kind of like a lock and key thing. And by habit, every time you go to the supermarket, just the logo of the supermarket, the fact that you prepared and you did a little shopping list and everything will put you in that mode. Now, in that mode, you just saw products on the shelf and made these associations and saw t-shirts and jeans and no tigers. And so that becomes an entire shopping experience. It's an entire world that's based on the level set of all these hormones. And then you get into, the action potential why previous in that same level. So I hope that makes sense, but it's saying that the neurons are being reused. They're not being, they're pretty much single-use, single-mode things in most neural nets. So you kind of basically have a weighting, and then they propagate forward. But they don't have this kind of incredible complexity and this explosion of combinatorics. So now, that's one thing. Now, the other thing that is saying, if we look under the hood and see is, how complex can these things be and what's their limit? The other thing is what we mentioned before, and that's the digital. As soon as something is digital, it's got a number of problems. One of them is the clock, and it's approximation. So by being deterministic, it costs plenty of information. So certainty costs plenty. And now there were, when computers started out, there were analog computers. They're all digital now. But they went down the path of digital computers because they were deterministic. Analog computers were hard to predict and control, and they weren't obedient. And so they didn't fit with the mindset of slave owners, which is, control freaks, which is what all of this is about. So analog computers got kind of ditched. Now, when we've gone, deep into digital computers, and we're trying to make digital computers mimic the human brain and mimic intelligence, now they need that complexity. But unfortunately, nobody developed these analog computers. So digital computers are plagued by a single thread of execution, and you always know something's digital if you look under the hood. If you look at the schematics of an electronic circuit today, a digital circuit, you see all these little discrete modules and chips and things like that, but they all in the schematic have this little input saying CLK, CLK bar. What that is clock. It says they're all clocked, and they all have to be clocked because they have to be gated in sequence. So you can have parallelism, but at some stage you've got synchronization problems, and there are various well-known problems of synchronization in computing. But in an analog computer or the human brain, nothing is synchronized. Everything is parallel. And so then you start to see, what I'm saying is that we've made a big mistake thinking that logic is discrete and it's stepwise and has to be clocked, so that you have to have the step order execution of these logical modules. So okay, by way of analogy, let me explain it like this. A clocked circuit and AI and computing, digital computing in general, is imagine a metaphor for, say, a city like Venice. And all the electrical pathways are the canals, and the current is the water. It's kind of like, think of it, the flow of the water going through all the canals is like the flow of the electricity through this electrical circuit. Electrical engineers don't like that analogy for electricity as flow of water, but it worked for Tesla, so let's go with it. Now, what you're doing in a digital circuit is that, so everything is deterministic. So you would say they're all locks. On each canal, they're locks, and you'd say, a transistor is in effect saying this lock is open when, here's the brilliance of a transistor, is you can have a side canal, in other words, a bit of current coming in from the side, and that is enough to open the lock on a main canal. Or stop it. So in other words, if you have a little bit of current coming through this little waterway on the side, it can be enough. There's a mechanism that then, closes the lock. And then, you go down further down the canal, and there's another gate and another lock, and then it all loops back to come back to the first one. Hurrah! We have something that's starting to look like intelligence. Now, that's how roughly analogous to how digital circuits work. But now analog circuits work like this, and you can start to see how far away AI is from the human brain and from analog and, deep complexity. So if you had another Venice that was entirely analog, you would have to imagine that there are all these myriads of effects. So in other words, you've got the best of both worlds, because you have gates as well as, the flow of the canals is entirely open. So in other words, if you put an input into, say, one side of Venice, say on the main canal, you raise the water level. How that would propagate through in the digital thing is very predictable. It would go here till this gate opened, this gate closed, then all the way through. Now, if you did that in an analog computer, or this analog city that modeled logic through the canals of a city network, you raise the water level on this canal, it would flow through the city. Now, think about it. It would be very, very complex. There'd be little eddy currents. There'd be, Navier-Stokes equations. If you had to model it digitally, it would be impossible, because you would get soliton waves here. You would get just how the canal bent. The fact that there was a frog sitting on the canal here, sometimes and sometimes not, would cause ripples that would propagate through the city. Then you'd get incredible stuff happening. You'd have, all these soliton waves you'd never see coming, that all converge in one, in one convergence zone, make a huge water spout. It would look like freaking Disneyland. You can never get that out of a clockwork canal system. So in other words, the very, very fine structure. So from neurotransmitters, everything matters. It's not just a synapse and a neuron and, little symbols representing them. There must be shape and structure. Each one of those things is kind of like the shape of the canal that makes the speed of the wave come, and how the equilibrium and the echoes, and that they all must be in the fine detail that neurologists haven't got to yet. So in other words, okay, so let's sum up. There's this multimodality, right? There's also, because it's analog and it's open. The structure, the mechanism in it goes all the way down to the Planck length and maybe further, and all of those details bubble up. So you say, well, how long does it take can we make a city that's analog, like make a Venice, where we do a logical system based on the waterways and the height of the water, and the same is, how long would it take to just develop that, just do a training algorithm and just make it an electrical circuit like that? And you say, well, there's long evolution. And you say, well, we evolved all those little things, that amazing little water spouts and stuff all those little water features that would happen in that canal, in that analog Venice. it, you could eventually mimic them with discrete digital technology, but imagine how difficult it would be, and you would also have to expend the sort of energy to brute force and train that system. You would have to spend the sort of energy that we've spent over 3.4 billion years. So yeah, the tree of life has, just imagine how much energy was expended by all these organisms to get to evolve the human brain. And you can't escape that. You'd have to do something similar. So in terms of scale and energy and stuff, it's like AI is not going to get there. I mean, ever. But yeah, so okay, so I'll pause there because I bet Ryan's got a lot to say here. But I'll pause here and then I'll come back to what I think is happening with intelligence and what we evolved to do. We didn't evolve to be goal-oriented. That's a big mistake. I think goal orientation is stupid. I mean the goal-oriented behavior. If you opened the hood on an artificial intelligent machine and said, "Oh, it's goal-oriented," you'd say, "Okay, then it's stupid." Now we say the opposite. We say it's definition of artificial intelligence is goal orientation in a confined context, or closed context. But I'd say no. If it is like that, then it's stupid. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I was doing circuits, electronic circuits for line following automata and things like that. And so they're very, very simple. They just you just have two detectors, and the current gets bigger as soon as they approach the white line, left and right. So goal-oriented things are impeccably stupid. And look at goal-oriented people; they're impeccably stupid. But we consider them intelligent. Well, no, it's our alien cortex, and our alien cortex is stupid. So goal-oriented behavior is dumb. Yeah. So then you say, well, what is intelligence? And I'll say, well, I've got a good theory for that, but I better let Ryan speak because he's probably on hot coals by now.
Yeah, I think that when you say goal-oriented behavior is stupid, I think what's important about goal-oriented behavior is it's predictable. So it's legible to the system, and it's something that, if someone is chaotic or really diverse in their thinking, then that will be, they'll be scorned rather than praised as intelligent. Usually when someone is praised as intelligent in society, it's when someone reinforces the existing system in a novel way or an interesting way. And so, yeah, I would say that predictability is what the economy is after. And I think that I want to clarify some terms. So when we say AI, sometimes we're saying what the current state of the art is, and sometimes we're referring to general intelligence. So when we say we're never going to get there with AI, of course we have AI right now, and it's narrow AI and it's functional. And the term to disambiguate these is usually AGI, artificial general intelligence. And that's the one that he was saying that is probably not feasible with the approach that we've been taking. And then another, interesting definitions or analogies, you went to cities, which I think is a pretty interesting place to go, because in many cases, people have made the claim that artificial general intelligence already exists, and that is society itself. That the economy and all of that is we are the neurons in that, and or the component parts of that, and our collective intelligence emerges to solve problems that none of us could individually solve. And it's I think that we need to be a little bit careful when we ascribe intelligence to either the human brain or society, because if the thing that is fatal about our condition is a part of our human brain or a part of our society, then maybe it's not so intelligent after all. Maybe that 1% of DNA that's different between us and chimpanzees doesn't account for much of a difference in intelligence there. And so yeah, if anything is intelligent at all, we could say it's us. But I'm hesitant to go there. I think the other aspect is that you mentioned that the random noise is clearly unintelligent, but we also should point out that if an artificially intelligent algorithm says consistently only wrong answers, then that is also intelligent, or it's almost as good as getting all the right answers, because you can just invert the inputs or something. You need to know enough about the structure of the thing you're describing to be able to get it wrong consistently, as well as to get it right consistently. So that's another thing. And then yeah, I guess the point about the analog and digital is a very, very fundamental point. It's almost like a dualism type of point. We have discrete mathematics and continuous mathematics, and we have discrete physics and continuous physics. I mean, I guess quantum physics is somewhat continuous too, but it's we get this particle wave duality and these kinds of things. They're all very related to how we're trying to wrestle with what reality is, and those domains seem to be somewhat incompatible. There's like an impedance mismatch between them. So when we try to represent one and the other, the whole idea behind calculus is, yeah, you can chop it up into little chunks that are discrete and just get infinitely many of them, and then maybe you can actually get to the smooth version. And maybe that's what AI will do. We'll chop up, what the brain is actually doing into little chunks and get as much resolution as you like. But he was saying that there's that the limit there doesn't work.
I can actually prove it. There's an easy proof. And that's what we're trying to do, is really square the circle, almost literally. If you get a square wave, which if the digital universe was correct, if there was such a thing, and it wasn't an approximation, you could have a genuine square wave. But you can prove in a number of different ways, from Fourier analysis or any other thing, is that you can't have a genuine square wave. You can only have an approximation of a square wave that has rounded corners. And that's the essence of why digital is wrong, is those rounded corners. You can never, ever have a square wave. This universe will permit smooth waves, but not square waves. So they're all approximations. So there's always more information in the smoothness than there is in the digits. And that's a lesson we just refuse to learn in academia.
Yeah, I think that's
true. But
true.
It's literally almost squaring the circle.
Yeah, that's true. It's not quite a chaotic boundary, but it's a at the corners of the square wave, it's pretty funky up there. Up and down squiggles going pretty wild. It only smooths out in the middle of the square. So, but I think the issue is one where in many cases, I think intelligence is predicated upon that the filtering mechanisms that you're talking about, that inhibitory nature, the ability to compress information and select out what's salient from it. So by I think the that's where you're seeing the LSD trip. It's that compression, that filtering is kind of turned off, right? So you're getting lots more input than normally, and it's running wild and it's not being inhibited, right? So I think that and what's interesting there is that it gets to something fundamental in AI, and that is there are two general principles: exploration and exploitation. So if you're looking at a fitness landscape, say, imagine a topographical map where you have hills and valleys, and say you could call that, say, a fitness landscape. The higher the value, or the lower the valley, the more the optimal it is, or the higher the hill, the more optimal it is, according to some metric that you pick. So you pick the goal, you pick whatever, how you're going to evaluate something. But let's say, to figure out a maze, or to figure out, anything really, you can create a space which has this fitness landscape in multiple dimensions, but we can just stick to like a 3-dimensional thing because it's easier to imagine. So in AI, a lot of that is you have to have search in some way to figure out what to do next. And if you are exploiting where you are, the information you are, let's say you're walking up a hill. Exploiting is, okay, well, how do I get to the optimal place? Well, I should be aiming to go up the hill as steeply as possible so that I get to the top, right? But once so that gives you better and better refined results. But once you get to the top of the hill, there may be Mount Everest to your left, but in order to get to it, you'd have to go down a hill. So you have to go against the rule of optimality, like chasing that to get to the new hill that would be even better. So there's exploration there. So you need to jump from hill to hill, essentially. Go like randomize your position, go somewhere new, and then start climbing a new hill. And with enough of these different paths that you take, you can eventually find a pretty good solution to whatever you're looking for. Now, the tricky thing there is that I think this is often what is happening for people under psychedelic effects, is that the typical mind modalities are such that they are constrained to a particular hill in their mind. So if they're in a neurosis, they're stuck in a loop and they can't break out. Let's say they have some kind of trauma, or they have something that they just can't stop recalling and being focused on. That's a local optima. That's in the path of least resistance in their brain, right? So they're just stuck in that. Under psychedelic effects, that kind of gives you the exploration. So maybe it doesn't make much sense to go down the hill. Maybe you're going to see a tiger on the shelf, and it's not optimal, but it'll get you to a new place. And that new place in your brain maybe is a more natural optimum for where you are in that actual landscape. So I think this is also kind of an algorithm in AI called simulated annealing, which is like cooling crystals. I mean, he will know everything about that, both annealing and simulated annealing. But it's essentially, if you were to take this topographical map and you toss a bunch of sand on the top of it, and then you start shaking it really hard at first, it'll jump to all the valleys that it should go to more easily. But if you start shaking more slowly and more slowly and more slowly, all the sand will go, at the in the lowest parts of the topographical map, right? It'll settle to where the optimum solutions are, and that's simulated annealing. You can program it to do that, and it's also done with genetic algorithms and these kind of things. But that's generally something that's used in every major artificial intelligence algorithm is, either gradient descent. Essentially means that exploitation algorithm. So if you're trying to do hill climbing, this kind of thing, that's used in gradient descent. You use that to solve things with deep learning, and in general, it's a it's a principle that I think we can learn from, both as when we're looking at our psychedelic experiences, as well as drawing analogy to how we understand intelligence. They should both have exploitation and exploration as a part of them.
Yeah, okay, I've got a lot to say on this. So, yeah, I don't really agree that that's what's happening with psychedelics. So, psychedelics are good for exploration. In other words, they're good for getting you out of a local optima or minima. But anything that's kind of a premature optimized solution, they get you out of that, because if you go back to my Hebbian wiring model, they artificially put you in a state of panic, so in hyperarousal. And so then anything, it allows wiring over much larger distances. So it simulates you getting off a premature peak, because it has so many pathways out of it. It's kind of it's analogous to raising the temperature in some kind of dynamic system, so that it kind of melts. And so if you melt the whole system, then you can re-anneal it and get down to something that's maybe, if you're lucky, more optimal. The problem is that there's this underlying assumption, which I think is absolutely fundamentally wrong. And again, it goes back to this goal-oriented thing. So there's this pervasive idea that comes clearly from our alien cortex, which has really sent us down the wrong path. And that's this idea of problem solving. So there's this idea that intelligence is problem solving. And again, I think it's an utterly stupid idea. Because problem solving implies that you have a goal. You have a presupposed goal, and intelligence are things that get you towards that goal. And I'd say, no, that's not intelligent at all. But that's become ubiquitous in a lot of our thinking. So even these guys in like DeepMind, they said, first solve the problem of intelligence, and then use intelligence to solve all our problems. You say, guy, where do you get the idea that they're problems? That they're problems and they're solutions, and that's your left brain. It's mad. It's fucked up. There are no problems and solutions and stuff except that you make out of nothing. So all this idea, even talking about annealing landscapes and exploration, is this pervasive idea that the whole world works from dopamine, that we have dopamine is telling us that we must get the prize. And then we have this idea that intelligence has something to do with a maze and a reward. Saying, no. This is such a bad, in a way, this in terms of theories, this is a premature optimization. This is a place where you're going nowhere, right? This is a local minima that you can't get out of, and it's a stupid way of thinking. So a maze is not a test of intelligence. So, okay, so I think a much better model for thinking about what general intelligence is and what the human brain has evolved to do, and then from that you can figure out the difference between us and chimpanzees, and so again, I think it always come back to it's a signal, right? So it has far more to do with signaling. So intelligence doesn't really work in a simple model where you just say, well, it's goal-oriented problem solving. I don't think that, first of all, it seems idiots. It's like, how does the machine's already intelligent if it has a goal? So it's the goal setting, the idea that there is a goal. You say, well, maybe it's just a mouse in a maze getting food, and everybody needs food, and I think these these things like getting food are, it's our brain projected. It's basically, it's unwarranted our psychology projected on the world. That is not what a mouse is doing. You might think, oh, a mouse wants food and it's going and it's solving the maze so it can get to the food. And it's like, ooh, this is a very, very dangerous way of thinking. You're missing some deep fundamentals on what the universe is actually doing. And that it is not little agents that desire things and then use their intelligence to get what they desire. That's fucked up with a capital F. And that's the basis of a lot of what we're doing and then why AI. So I can tell you from so many ways why this is fucked up. But again, you'll get to an enantiodromia. The very act of doing that kind of pursuit misses some fundamentals of the universe. And I think the way to get to what are those fundamentals of the universe is far better to think of intelligence only works when it's communication between two parties. So in other words, take something like a Turing test. Is what you're really doing is saying, is this machine, does it think like me? And that the Turing test is saying, like, do we have correspondence between, can we communicate? And I think that is very, very important. Intelligence is actually communing between two parts of a system. So in other words, let's just take a wild leap back to the mouse in the maze. So the mouse is not going after the reward. It's the mouse and the hunger of the mouse and the potential energy of it is a disequilibrium. And what the mouse is doing is achieving equilibrium by going and eating whatever the reward is. So you have to imagine the entire universe is a disequilibrium system, and intelligence emerges as the opposite of, basically resolving the disequilibriums. So in other words, intelligence resolves to create disequilibriums. It's kind of like a complex knot in the energy landscape of the universe. It's kind of like DNA is also like this. It's kind of the universe is just trying to get to an equilibrium state over all parameters.
Yeah, I've heard of that definition as the definition of being alive as well.
Yeah. This is where I'm going. This is where so being alive, I mean, is it's a complexity that goes against the stream of this equilibrium. So in other words, DNA is a funny thing that happened to me on the way to complete equilibrium for the universe's point of view. So well, why does DNA exist? Because it's self-reinforcing. So basically, it's going against the stream of the universe. It's saying. So it's creating complications for the universe. So it's creating local optima. So the local optima, in a way, are intelligent because those are the things that the universe is trying to get to equilibrium states, but it gets frustrated. And in terms of things like a glass, you anneal to a glass. It's life and is all the discontinuities and imperfections in that glass. It means those are what the structures are. And the reason why they exist is because they're self-reinforcing. So going back to the video I made on fractal theory of evolution, so the reason why they're self-reinforcing is because they have feedback back to themselves. And so it's saying why, so you have, like I said, it's like you have these focal points of attraction and repulsion, you have feedback, and you have filters. And so those are the things that create the complexity that stops nature going in a straight line towards its optimum. So it's all trying to get to its perfect energy state of zero equilibrium, but it can't really get there. It's trying to do Maupertuis's least action. And so it can't take the path of least action because it's frustrated by these complications, and these complications are a proxy for intelligence. So it's saying, well, what is intelligence? I think it's much better to look at it in terms of communication. So I'm looking at it much more in terms of signal theory. Then again, as soon as we start talking signal theory and Shannon and compression and stuff, again, we've got it all upside down. We fundamentally, our culture, our way of thinking, our alien cortex lives in upside down land. And so again, you just apply, invert it. So what we say is incompressible is the information. No. The incompressible stuff is not the information. It's the compressible stuff that's the information. It's the repetition. So, okay, now that's going to make people really upset. I'm sure some people are going to get real upset with that. But think of it this way. If I do a Turing test, right, if I say something like, I'm trying to see if this machine is genuinely, so if it has general intelligence, so you'd set up a few controls that are humans and a few machines and say, can I tell the difference between the human and the machine? Well, I think if I show you this example, so, okay, if I said to the machine, like, okay, complete this, da, 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 da. Now, everybody knows what comes next, right? Everybody on this call knows that if I go, da, 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 you can almost hear it, right? The machine would have a very, very difficult time trying to say that. If it was like Watson and stuff that amazed everybody by winning a Jeopardy and stuff, it would say like, da, what is surrealist? It would come up with all these kind of things. But any human can know that it's, if I say da, 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 and say, what are they doing? And saying, I'm communicating to you. I'm saying, I'm interrogating you. Is your brain the same as mine? So in other words, there's not some abstract tower of capability called intelligence that's super problem solving and stuff. It's like, no, it's not what intelligence is. Intelligence is communication, and it's identification of self with self. So again, in the Darwin videos, then I said that the reason why it exists and the reason why it seems to have got, intelligence seems to have evolved to get more complex over time is the same reason why sexual organs tend to get more complex over time. And the reason is it's to differentiate signal from noise. So for life to exist, you have to have a self-reinforcing feedback. You have to have filter feedback that reinforces the signal. Because why? Because of this kind of tautology. Is if you don't reinforce the signal, then Boltzmann entropy will take over and you'll get disorder. So to get this kind of order, it has to be self-reinforcing, and that implies that. So the filter is to identify self. I think what you can see this all over in nature. The predominant thing is not some Darwinian evolution. They're things that are seeking self. So in other words, you can see in birdsong, and I gave the example in the video of birdsong, is that with a timing circuit, a bird can put out a signal that says, it's kind of like, where are you? A wolf howling for a mate. All of them are saying like, where are you? Where are my mates? And it can only differentiate from the background noise of trees and ambient noise and things by having an algorithm. So in other words, what it's doing is what I said in the beginning, is that you have to look under the hood to see what generates this output to decide whether it's intelligent. And so if that's exactly what, say, in sexual dimorphism and things, is say a female putting out a call and males responding, or the other way around, is they really saying, do you have this circuit in your brain? And it can be as simple as da 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 da, and they say, do you have that little circuit in your brain? Rocks don't have it, other animals don't have it, and so you can say yes, yes, but you get into this, pick me, I have it, and then basically you make beautiful love. So it's really what intelligence is since Abelard and Eloise and all its Romeo and Juliet. It's like finding like. It's negotiation between communication. So it's communing. So it means that you have to have a repetition to communicate. So Now, it doesn't, it becomes like dueling banjos, because as soon as you have many parts that, reproduce the same signal, then suddenly the filter has more choice, and then you need refinement. So you get into a dueling banjo situation, because you're saying you're getting into ever finer details. So in other words, if it's a kind of a dating game, it's like, oh, you like movies? Oh, geez, I like movies too. Oh, do you like going to restaurants? I like going to restaurants too. Oh, we're a match made in heaven. Well, that's a very, very simple algorithm right there. And if the, say, female has more choice, assuming she's doing sexual selection, then she would say like, okay, all the guys say they like movies and they like going out to dinner. Let's see what kind of movies you like. Oh, slasher movies? Okay, you're out. I was hoping you like chick flicks and stuff. But you see, they have to get more and more nuanced to make sure once there's noise. So in other words, the signal itself, as it repeats, it makes its own noise. Just because, if you say da 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 da, you'll get 1,000 people, 40,000 people will respond with the thing. You're just like, oh, okay, I can't make head or tail out of that. So making head or tail out of it, the pattern recognition, is you're saying, let's get more subtle. So part of the thing for a Turing test is to really see and fall in love with a machine, is you'd really have to give it more and more complex prompts, and then saying exactly, do you have this communing intelligence with me? In other words, exactly what I was saying with the IQ test, where I said this, IQ test isn't a test of intelligence. Well, it's what it is like I said, it's really a test for. It's not for a test of an abstract scalar quality called IQ or intelligence. Can you guess what the examiner was thinking? So in other words, the examiner is just like a bird putting out a call saying, if I put out this, what's your response? Now, there are lots of responses that you could easily argue. In fact, that math blogger thing I showed you, that you could put out any sequence or any response and it's valid. I can show you mathematically that you can have any mechanism or logic that will make sense out of any sequence. So that means that there is no intelligence in a response. It means it's mathematically provable. So then what is happening with the examiner is, what they're just saying is, do you have my kind of intelligence? It's the alien cortex interrogating all these poor kids who's saying, is like, do you think like me? And that's all that's happening. So if you get a huge IQ result, like 160 on the IQ, oh, you're a genius. So no, you're just very good at communing with the guy that set the test.
I think that's why you have the G being so predictive of success in life, is that if you are aligned to the system, therefore you have IQ. And so you'll be successful in the system.
Yes. They're presenting intelligence. So in other words, just if you look at all these filtering stages in our culture, since you went there, if you look in a job interview, the job interviews, they're not, it's a silly game where they're not trying to see what you know really or anything. They're often described as like, do you fit in, or something like that. But what they're really trying to do is they're filtering out people that won't play their game. In other words, that won't fit in with the algorithm in the company. And the game is always lying. So what's going on in an American corporation is they're stealing your labor. So they're going to say, it's basically, an interview is a subtle way of saying, are you going to allow us to steal your labor? And they always ask a very pertinent question to say, like they say, now, why do you want to work at this company? Now, they know, any interviewer that's ever asked that question knows that you don't want to work at that company. You want the fucking money. But why do they always ask it? They want to see that you can lie. They want you to see that you can say, if you said the honest truth, say, I don't want to work here. I need fucking money or I'm going to die. And they said like, oh, well, that's true, but a bit too honest, so fuck off. You'd fail the interview. But they want you to say, you know, I looked you up on the internet and I see that you have social values and basically you're an ESG company and that's what I'm looking for because I also care about the environment. And they go, yeah, okay, you got the job. And the reason you got the job is because you're prepared to lie for a small wage. And that's what they're really testing. So in other words, there's the filtering process is positive and negative. It's like, do you think like me? Will you fit in with this algorithm? And then that's, you know, and they're saying is, you know, they have a goal to make money, and then they're saying, will you fit in with the goal? In other words, can we shortchange you with less money and you'll still be in the goal? And so the whole system is antagonistic towards each other, but the reason why it works is because there's an attractor, and that's money. And so people are attracted to work to companies because they have you know, they have money. That's the only reason they work there. If companies didn't have money, I don't think the workforce would be, because most jobs are shitty, and nobody would do them if they didn't get paid for them, which is a giveaway right there. But yeah, but you can see why, exactly as you're saying, Ryan, why our society got to this is because we're thinking of it as goal-oriented and problem-solving. Now, the fundamental reasoning, the assumption that nobody questions, that is so wrong, but is a false assumption that no one dares question, is there really anything, are there really any problems? Now, if you say this, then people get really upset. So Leibniz said it. Leibniz said this is the best of all possible worlds. In other words, you don't have to have any goals. You don't have to pursue anything. This is the best of all possible worlds. You can fuck it up, for sure, but there's no problem to fix. There is nothing wrong with it. Now, everybody lampooned him because, you know, they made Dr. Pangloss and stuff was how, I can't remember who wrote that. But anyway, he was completely lampooned for saying that this is the best of all possible worlds. And they said, well, it's all right for him. He's an aristocrat. And what about, you know, look at the injustice. Look at the rapes and murders and the corruption and the exploitation. And say, really? You can't think of a better world than this? It's like, yeah. So, but the thing is that if you look at all those so-called problems, they have an uncanny source underneath them. They all seem to me, at least, to be associated with the alien cortex. So when you look at all the imperfections that they say and they lampoon Leibniz about, is this module of evil in our head, and it's the alien cortex. The alien cortex is making all these problems, and then it's offering the solutions. So it's saying, and then it's saying that's intelligent, but it's not. It's superfluous to requirements, and it's going to be short-lived, because if you think about it, executing to completion, which is what it's going to do with our extinction, is it is pursuing those goals. I mean, look at the macro system and the big picture of the world. In pursuing all these goals, like, you know, how do we make cities less polluted by horse manure? Oh, right, we make the internal combustion engine. Oh, Jesus, now we've polluted the entire biosphere with CO2. And then like, oh, what are we going to do next? And we go on to like, oh, nuclear. Oh, that'll work. I mean, this track record, this is going to work. So basically, we keep on doubling down on the problems and never seeing that basically solving problems. There's no such thing as a solved problem. It basically is it's creating more problems. So anybody that, in my book, how can you call something intelligence that goes to solve problems and creates more problems? So in other words, it's trying to bring things to equilibrium and making more disequilibrium. And saying like, well, yeah, that is kind of intelligence, as long as basically the disequilibrium doesn't annihilate itself, which is what happens. You see, if you just let the algorithm play out, you would find that it was self-reinforcing. The signals would reinforce the signals, and the noise would reinforce the noise, and it would kind of equilibrate on a boundary of chaos. But I just wanted to, I'm sure Ryan wants to speak now, but I just wanted to say one more thing about smoothness, that you mentioned smoothness. It's well worth looking at, you see, you might be wondering, well, how I get a fractal universe out of this, but I can explain, but it's difficult. But I can show you things like, there's like Newton's fractal. Newton's fractal is an amazing thing that comes out of Newton's method for finding the roots of a polynomial. So if you think of a graph with axes, right, then you imagine this nice smooth graph. The points where it crosses the x graph are actually the roots of the polynomial. So Newton had this way of seeing, you know, by approximation, where the roots were. So you take an arbitrary value, say on the x and y axis, you see what y is. You take another one, move a little bit to the left, and then you say, oh, is it really steep? So in other words, it's a kind of a hill climbing algorithm. Newton was doing a hill climbing algorithm on this graph like Ryan was talking about. Now here's the thing. If you go and look deeply, Newton never saw this. Although it's called Newton's fractal, Newton never understood fractals. In fact, he had a blue fit as soon as he got on the three-body problem. He had to look at this monster in front of him and just ran. So that approximation of Newton, if you then say, okay, what if you take arbitrary places around the plot? You'd say, okay, well, say there's 3 roots to this polynomial. Then what would you expect? You'd expect the whole plane to be divided up neatly into 3s, and you know, if you have a starting point here that, you know, evolves to this root, and then you have a starting point here, you assume that'll resolve to the closest root to it, and the third root, say in this polynomial, you'd say, well, you'd have this domain that's closer to there, and they probably kind of work out to have a nice little 3 zones around the roots, and you know, you would converge on those roots. It's roughly like that, except when you get to the boundaries between the two. When you get to the boundaries, then it suddenly gets very, very complicated. Just this side of the boundary will then take you to this root, just this side. So Newton's approximation just suddenly gets into this terrible froth of fractals. Now, when you look at those fractals, they're absolutely beautiful. They have all the structure. They got this infinite, you know, you can zoom in on them. And get this, out of this, somewhere pops out the Mandelbrot set. You can see the cartoid and the little snowman. And you think, what the fuck? In the middle of a smooth graph solving polynomials, Mandelbrot leaps out, you know, in your face. And you say, there's the smoothness of the universe is hiding incredible complexity, and that complexity is fractal. And so that is kind of my absolute slam dunk for why AI and discrete digital intelligence can never get close to natural processes like the human brain in terms of general intelligence, is because we on that intelligence is exploring that fractal area in so many ways. It isn't exploring, you know, the boundary condition on the edge of chaos.
Yeah,
and so
the hill climbing algorithm that I mentioned only works in a smooth landscape. So if you have a chaotic landscape with discontinuities in it, then climbing a hill doesn't matter, right? You're just gonna, you can't predictably go towards the solution.
Yeah, so just wait, let's just expand on that for the benefit of other people that maybe don't know what you're talking about. So hill climbing is you know, finding, kind of like Newton finding the solutions to a smooth graph like a polynomial in 3D space, let's say. Now, if you just see what Ryan said, is saying if you have a complex or chaotic landscape, in other words, the graph has more than 2 dimensions, then it's very, or a dimension, you know, somewhere between 2 and 3. So if you look at, say, imagine this 3D landscape or graph generated by a computer. If it maps to something like the real world, what you're measuring, it depends on how big your yardstick is. So in other words, if there's a little bump, you can't see that bump unless you have a yardstick that's smaller than that bump. So being digital, it means that you have to have a ruler of a certain dimensions, like integers or something like that. It cannot have infinite scale. Otherwise, it becomes unworkable. But nature is using an infinite scale ruler. So in other words, when I measure, say, the surface area of a bump in the real world, like a mountain, then I can say, well, if I use a kilometer-sized ruler, you can say, well, it's 1 kilometer on this side, 1 kilometer on that side. And you say, wait a second. Get a 100-meter ruler. Now there are a lot more bumps, and you can measure a lot more things. And it's saying, like, well, now suddenly the surface area of that mountain got huge. And you say, well, hang on a minute. What happens if I get a meter ruler? Well, now there are even more bumps, and now you're starting to see trees and stuff. And as you go down, eventually you get to the Planck length. You know, it'll take you like the lifetime of the universe to measure a small mountain, because imagine you've got to go through each leaf, and then you've got to go around the little bumps on each one of the little vesicles on the leaves, and then you have to, you know, go around the structure there is a bit lumpy, and eventually you're getting down to the molecules, and the, you know, oh, those are lumpy as hell. And eventually you say, like, well, this thing which looked like it might have been a square kilometer of surface area is now has a surface area of something like the size of the galaxy. So there's a lot of stuff folded up into, and this is just a mountain, like one I'm looking at out of the window. It's like next time you go out for a walk, say, what's the surface area of the 100 meters around me? Then, you know, walk over to a tree or something like that. Go and look at the bark and say, well, if I measure all the lumps and little lines and stuff, and I go more and more and look more and more in detail, I think, you know, the 100 meters around you is vast. It's kilometers and kilometers, maybe not infinite, but you get into limits. But if you had to navigate that space, it would take more energy and time than, you know, ain't nobody got time for that. This universe
if we
probably
didn't have a Planck length,
cares.
then it would actually be infinite, probably. Because so in fractal, when you're looking at a fractal, very often, like if you look at Sierpinski's triangle or something, that has a finite area and an infinite perimeter. Like you'll never be able to measure the end of it. So it's if you're using a ruler and you're measuring things, maybe you can get some smoothness rules. You can apply mathematics and these kinds of things, and that's what we do with geometry and you know trying to parcel out land with our forestry and whatnot. But once you if you change the ruler, then all of those things aren't pointing in the same direction anymore. You get different derivatives, different paths up the hill that you should have taken if you use a different size ruler, right? So if you have a chaotic system, or you have a non-differentiable point in your landscape, then you don't know which direction to go. It's impossible to predict what you would go to next, and that predictability is what I think is favored by the system, and that's why we get this goal-oriented behavior. So especially the financial system relies on predictability. If you're going to be making investments in capitalism, you need to know that the thing that you're putting your money in is going to give you more money out, and that requires a bit of predictability. You need to be able to understand what's going to happen next, and what ends up happening as a result of that is that AI, or the system in general, will constrain us to be more predictable, rather than solving the more general problem. It'll oppress us to make us simpler. And this is, if you look at what B.F. Skinner did in psychology, he was like the king of psychology for a while, because he was able to find predictable results in animal behavior by saying, okay, well, if I starve these chickens and make them suffer, then lo and behold, they'll learn to push the button to get the food, right? They'll do what I train them to do. But that's only because he made the system simpler by starving the chickens. And we will be made simpler by starving us of humanity through our social media feeds, through our education system, through our legal system. We will be made predictable and legible. And what you said earlier about that the goal-seeking behavior is trying to reach equilibrium, the definition of death is equilibrium. That is what we are trying to seek in seeking equilibrium. Life is disequilibrium. It is when it stops moving around and it returns to the equilibrium, that's when the life is stopped. Like if you have dead matter, it's at equilibrium. And so that goal-seeking behavior, whether it's seeking money, like you mentioned with the job, or seeking something else, it generates death on the way there, because it's seeking that equilibrium, it's seeking that predictability, that simplicity, that is oil and water with nature. Nature is a complex system, so if it is complex, it cannot be financialized. It must be simplified. It must be made orderly, and so must you be. And this is why when he was saying that the universe is fractal in nature, that's why the universe is being destroyed by the world is being destroyed, because nature is not simple, predictable, and Newtonian in that manner, which if it were, then we would long ago have conquered it all, right? We're getting there bit by bit now, but nature is putting up a good fight by being so complex and unpredictable. But
well, you can even hear it in the language it uses too when they say neutral and objective. Like neutral is what a hitman uses after he kills somebody. Target neutralized.
Yep.
You're neutral when you're dead.
I think this is a great expansion on the Desiderata 3. I feel what you've been talking about, and this navigation and this razor edge and entropy. It's really that we're talking about. I feel that,
Yes, it is. It's fundamentally, though, staying on the razor's edge is what life is doing by being self-reinforcing. But yeah, I think we definitely go for the idea that AI is death-seeking, and so artificial intelligence is primarily death-seeking. But I think there's something more to highlight about it is the way it gets to that death is important. And so going back to something Ryan said about, say, the financial markets, you can see why the smoothing and predictability leads to death. It's because it's fundamentally borrowing. So this smoothing and this predictability, it comes at a huge price. Now, people think that it's for free. They think that when AI optimizes something or does something really smart, that it comes for free. But it changes the game. The mere fact that you're actually introducing it changes the game. So, for example, just the way they're thinking is a linear thinking that leads, I can show you why it's kind of like borrowing from the future. Because take, for instance, right now, the stock market. The stock market is, they want the stock market to go up predictably. The banker's dream is to have a 2% increase that reflects, progress of humanity, and that it would be stable without inflation. It would all be balanced. And so, but because economic systems are feedback loops, they have kind of weather, and they also have bankers which manipulate them. So they had business cycles. So ever since Bernanke was this consummate idiot of gargantuan proportions, and he did is his motivation was kind of like the motivation of these transhumanists, because he did his thesis on the Depression and how bad it was. I think he had some personal motivation, probably in his family they struggled during the Depression or something. I don't know. I think he had a personal dog in the fight, but his conclusion was that the Great Depression was totally unnecessary. They could have just printed their way out of it, which is absolute linear thinking. I can't help smiling. It's just so fucking idiotic. But anyway, so Bernanke comes in and then he tries to smooth everything out, make things predictable. And so what he did was, now whenever the stock market falters, he tried to smooth out the business cycle. And he achieved the opposite of what he was trying to achieve, because it became the Bernanke put. It means that, you see, just recently, in the last week, everything came out bad. Britain's GDP went down 20%. 20%. It's like unheard of. It's like Rome burning in 2020, and the stock market went up. It rallied. It's just like the thing I posted with Varoufakis, and you're saying Varoufakis gave the reason why. And it's because everybody expects the Bernanke put. They know that, oh, this is so bad that all the central banks, the Bernankes of this world, have to basically print lots of money. So they start buying stock on the anticipation that the stock market is going to be boom. And you're saying, like, well, now you're in deep trouble, because you see how that's smoothing. Now, if you look back, that every Bernanke put has inflated this bubble that eventually has to pop. But because otherwise you'll get eaten in the ass from some other direction, like hyperinflation, which is, so they caught in every way. They've been boxed in at this perfect storm of any way they go, they're fucked. And it all came from Bernanke trying to smooth the business cycle. So is in not taking their lumps, they didn't get rid of the business cycle. They just accumulated it, pushed it down the road, so that now we're going to have to take it in one big hit. Now, anybody could survive the business cycle. This one big hit is probably going to wipe out everything. So you see why this smoothing and this predictability and stuff is not, it's borrowing from the future. So so in other words, again, it's kind of like the ruler. It's like not following the dance. Is the universe is saying, okay, there's a little fluctuation here. This is a disequilibrium over here. And now what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to say, got it, and then you equilibrize on the Planck length. If you really were in with nature, you'd be innovating and adapting as fast as the background quantum froth, But the thing that is, we're kind of out of step with the kind of wrong kind of ruler, the wrong kind of measurement, this kind of smoothing. It's not saying now we're winning. It's saying, like, no, it looks like you're winning, like the same way as somebody that goes and does a spending spree on their credit card suddenly looks rich. It's just because they've got a Lexus in the driveway doesn't mean they're rich. It means they've got a huge deficit. And our whole economy is like that. And our whole complex economy is saying, look at all the fabulous stuff we've done. Look at the cities and cars and planes and what's the wealth that we have, the abundance and stuff. Say, no, you've made a big hole of debt that we still have to fill up. So in other words, we haven't got anywhere. There's no such thing as progress. We've just rearranged things, and we've rearranged things in such a way that it's a local optima for us. But it's breathtakingly stupid, because we still have to pay it down.
Debt. It's worse than debt. It's death. Because where we borrowed from was nature, right? So when you're talking about Bernanke, he used that mindset to smooth out the business cycle. Well, Gates wants to smooth out the ecology with geoengineering, right? It's the same mindset. Let's borrow from the future, and then when it hits, it's going to be the biggest hit that there is.
Yeah, as long as people understand that all of these things come at a price, and but they don't account for the deficit because it's an externality, and then super intelligence will sort it all out. So they're basically like spendthrifts, or people getting up to their eyeballs in debt. It's a kind of gambler's syndrome, and so they keep on thinking, well, we'll win big later. And say no, because the win that you'd have to have just doesn't get delivered by nature very often. So, it's kind of a log scale. And so you're saying that we must win like a gambler. We must like break the house. And it's like, yeah, we're going to break the house, all right. But we're soaring on the limb that we're sitting on. So, yeah, AI definitely leads to death. Ryan, I'll let you speak again, but I just remembered this thing which I wanted to mention to you in the last conversation we had. You mentioned the fixed action potential of animals, and I thought of a good one, one that you mentioned, but I lost it before I could express it, and I just wanted to express it to you in case you don't know it, but for the amusement of everybody else, is for a long time they thought that they looked at ants and collective intelligence of ants. So ants build these bridges, amazing bridges of in the Amazon and things like that. You get leafcutter ants. They bridge between leaves and they can go across rivers, and amazing spans, all just with ants linked together. And so they thought, for humans to do it, to build a human pyramid, if you've ever watched people doing a human pyramid, you can see there's a tremendous amount of coordination and cooperation and hierarchy and simplifications and all this till you can build a human pyramid. So, they do exercises like this in the army. Is like, here's a few telephone poles and tractor tires and stuff, and here's 50 guys get across this river, and they've got to use their intelligence and all to try get across the river. And so it was a mystery of saying, like, how do ants with such small brains, just a handful of neurons, do such complex behavior? And they looked into it and actually found out what it was. And it gives you a little clue into why you have to look at the mechanism and not the output. So what they found was that the ants are super dumb. They just run in a direction. Say they're going towards food or something, following a dopamine trail or something like that. So they run, and then they get to the edge of a leaf or something, a precipice, and what they do is they reach out, just have an instinctive behavior to just reach out and see if they can get across to the next thing. And that's it. That's all they do. Now, what makes the bridge is they found that if you just tap on the ant's back, so you just go pitter-patter on the back, it freezes. And that's all the bridge building behavior is. Because what happens is the ant comes, and while it's just exploring, trying to reach out to the next thing, and the other ants are so dumb, they just scramble over the top of it. They don't even recognize that it's a fellow ant. And the minute they pitter-patter on its back, it freezes. And then they do the same thing. They also reach out, and the third one will come and run over the two of them. So as long as they always have this pitter-patter of other ants running over them, they freeze. And that is all it is. It just gets more and more extended. You get a buttress just extended more and more as all of these things run. But if you stop the other ants from running over their backs, they will relax, and then the whole bridge will fall down. And if they can't actually bridge the thing, it just becomes like a wave, and it just curls right where the obstacle is, and it goes on. But it looks like fantastic intelligence, and all it is a simple rule that says, pitter-patter on my back, freeze. That's all. But you see all these motivational pictures and say teamwork, and stuff, and they, have them up in offices and say, like, if you only knew that behind that was the dumbest shit you ever saw. So in other words, the motivational posters in offices are funny as fuck, because what they're saying is, if you be a complete dumb fuck, it'll look like intelligence.
Yeah. That sounds a lot like the simple rules that create flocking behavior. So you head in this general direction of your neighbors. Don't get too close to your neighbors, and don't get too far away, and then you're done. Like, you've got the flocking behavior. And it used to be thought that, like in an alien cortex way, that animal behavior, they must be, a flock of geese, they must be following a leader bird. The grand leader of the pack is going to be, they're all just following that intelligent leader that's driving them forward. And it's nonsense. The complex behavior is all simple rules that you can boil down to just so what's funny about that leadership behavior is that it's not robust. Like, if that leader bird has a heart attack, where's the rule that says that you're all going to dive down into the mud with your leader, like the lemmings myth? Like, there's no such thing in nature like that, where it's so brittle, because it would have caused the extinction of whatever species it was. So when we do this hierarchical leader stuff, that ends up, creating a single point of failure for us as well. But it just makes it's more scalable for controlling larger and larger things through a pyramid structure.
Yes, so that is an important insight. So what's happening there is, again, a simplification that's trading off speed for fragility. So in other words, you can see it in say generals and armies, how they constituted. There's an interesting anecdote I read once about a senior general that was captured during the North African campaign, and he was taken to meet Rommel, and he was sat down, under guard, and it was kind of dark, and in the darkness he could see this guy in the back of a German staff car, and all these guys were running up to him and giving him notes and running, and he gradually started to realize, oh my fuck, this is Rommel himself. He's sitting like 10 foot away from me, and he's running the entire African campaign from the backseat of this car, and all these little runners coming back in little slips of paper. And he was absolutely appalled, because they didn't have an insight into how the German intelligence and machinery ran. They didn't know how the general staff worked in Germany. They thought it was the same as the Allied side. And the Allied side had all these conflicting allies with different generals with competing interests, and didn't really trust each other. And they were kind of like left wing. They couldn't get their act together, because people would argue, and then they would go against the plan or second guess the plan to their own advantage. And it was all a complete freaking mess. And then it took them ages and ages to come to a plan that was not very good. It was kind of like as good as you can come out of a committee. And then when he saw Rommel, then they suddenly understood why the Germans were kicking their ass so badly in North Africa. It's because Rommel was he was the central point, and he was doing the job of the anterior cingulus gyrus, in other words. And so he made decisions that would have taken them weeks to come to consensus. He did them instantly, like this. Just some runner would come up with a message, and he would just completely change his plan and something like that. But the problem is that Rommel made very basic mistakes. That if he had somebody to second guess him, or had a bit more of a staff, he wouldn't have made those mistakes. So in the end, he lost. But see what happened. The Germans, for a while, they seemed invincible, because they had that central control. But it was borrowed at the future expense of the direction of the Africa campaign. So eventually they lost, and lost big. But you see, that's again and again, you see this thing, big payoff in the short term. So they say, there's this horrible meme out there that says, about technology, and the transhumanists tell themselves, and they say, when you look at AI and this complete hype that has more to do with the fact that there's too much Bernanke money and no home for it, has got more to do. It's not, AI isn't making any advances. Don't believe all the scientific press and all the hoopla and all these it's all a big fan club. It's bullshit squared. And Xi Jinping's taken in by it. Oh, China's going to get to the head of AI. I was like, well, that's the end of China. If you pursue such a dim-witted goal, you'll get what you paid for. But it's a big bandwagon effect that has more to do with money and speculation than it does to any real advance in AI. But what these guys tell you is they say, well, the thing about technology is it gets overhyped in the short term and underhyped in the long term. So the long-term consequences have far more effect than, and so it's like, guys, that's absolutely meaningless. It's like, what are you saying? It's think about it. It's saying like, well, it was overhyped in the short term, but underhyped in the long term. That means no, then the short term was correct. It's just stupid. So it's like, what do you say that we get this? Sure, there's longer term impacts. What they're trying to say is there's longer term impacts, not longer term successes. So that what these technologies do have high impact, high negative impact, catastrophic impact. So a more correct thing we would say is you get early promise, like Rommel, because you can move fast. But as things spread out and get more complicated, your past catches up with you. Just like if you get a bucket of water and slosh it over an area of concrete, it'll spread out. And as it spreads out and branches, it starts to slow down. It starts to, the blitzkrieg turns into quagmire. And that's what we're doing with all this technology. We're doing a blitzkrieg that looks highly impressive in the short run for linear thinking idiots that don't understand the universe. And then it leads to complications, and then that complications become Byzantium, and then they become excessively bureaucratic. You see, it starts off with simplification, but Ryan is right. They will make us conform to the machine and do simplify our actions so that they conform with the limitations on the machine. But as things go on, it'll breed complexity because they're bound to have some kind of Tony Blair type idea. And they will say, well, we must have quality circles and we must have corrective behavior. And in doing that corrective behavior, they'll find all these permutations that will defeat them. So they will find that while they can ignore all the corner cases and all the complexity, then it will bite them later because they'll make catch-22s and they'll say, it's the same kind of thing. Like any bureaucracy, you say, well, you can see in a bureaucratic country like Greece, it's like, to get this thing done, you have to go and pay the small fee, which is like €5, but you have to pay it in a bank. Well, the bank won't accept your €5 thing without a bank account. To get the bank account, you need a tax number. Well, the tax number was the thing you were originally trying to get. So it effectively means it's impossible to get a tax number. So then they would find this and they would correct it and they'd say, okay, well, you have to go to this department to get a form to say that you were the special case so you can take it to the bank. Then they pass a law. And then it's getting more and more Byzantine and more complex. So in the pursuit of that perfection, in other words, with that problem-solving attitude, you will create more problems. You'll have more problems to solve. Now, if you're an economist, you say, well, that's an economy. More problems to solve, more jobs. We're getting somewhere. And say, no, you moron. You're getting to the opposite of what you're trying to achieve, which is predictability, abundance. And so you're going against your own thing. So there's this enantiodromy. Anyway, well, that's probably a good place to end. Does anybody want to say anything more on this topic?
I have something to say around, in the 1750s or so, an Irishman, Edmund Burke, made some observations in conservatism, which I find, keep resonating with the modern day a little bit. And that's that, he was pretty against some of the revolution, the revolution in France and stuff like that, because his argument was that the systems that we have in society are complex systems, and if you go messing with them, you may find out that you can't control the complexity and like it's going to go crazy. So he was a conservative, and he wanted to retain, you know, the royal situation. And you'll see some of these arguments like coming from Mr. Lobster.
JP.
Yeah. And he'll be saying that, oh, you know, Christianity is evolutionarily selected for to be the best thing, so you should believe in it, and these kinds of things that it has. You know, you don't go upsetting the apple cart because everything's fine the way it is, which is, you know, it's the core of conservatism. But when you apply conservatism to actual conservation, where you are essentially conserving the chaos and the natural order of things, rather than the artificial structure that has put people into the, you know, the prison yard that we're in, then it starts to make a lot of sense that, you know, we can't do predictability in terms of, you know, our landscape is not smooth. So why are we doing all this exploration and exploitation? Because the only thing we're doing is we're borrowing from the future. Then it'll eventually cause, you know, I'm sure the French Revolution didn't go quite as planned, right? So that kind of thing is liable to happen with everything that we're dipping our hands into. And I don't know. I thought that might be nice to wrap up with.
Well,
Yeah, maybe we should explore that in the next. Maybe we should explore that in the next one. So yeah, what did you want to say, DB?
Oh, I was gonna say that, yeah, it's that goal-seeking behavior. You know, we want the sugar cube. We're gonna move the goalpost, however, to get the sugar cube. Yeah, that's that goal-seeking behavior. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about like how nature resists that kind of parasitism. I could probably say it real quick. So there's this story I like this guy wrote that's based on like the natural behavior of eagles. And there's this young eagle flying around with his father, you know, learning how to fly, and his father bullied an osprey carrying a fish. And so the eagle got the idea that I could do that. So the eagle started bullying and harassing the osprey to get the fish. And eventually, the osprey brought its mate back and started bullying the eagle and taking his fish. And eventually, yeah, they beat up that eagle, nearly killed him, started taking his fish. But the thing is the animals eventually got bored of doing that, and the eagle learned it's easier to catch his own damn fish. And then the ospreys, you know, went back after the eagle stopped bullying them. Like I feel like nature resists that parasitism, but you know, with where we're at, we have this ability to knuckle down on it, and that's not good. That's very
Well, I
bad.
believe
We have to stop. Like the eagle, you know, the eagle decided, you know, stealing from these osprey is actually taking a lot more energy, and it's putting me in more danger than just catching my own damn fish.
I believe more than half of the species on Earth are parasites. I think I remember that being true. So I don't know that nature actually avoids parasitism, and that's just a.
Well,
But
yeah,
it does,
that's
This is a
true.
good.
That's true, but I feel like on the scale with animals like us, it kind of does a little bit. It doesn't get to the extent where
So maybe we should go into this in the next one, because this opens up some interesting stuff. And the yeah, I would call those symbiotes. So it's whether something is a parasite or a symbiote is it's subjective. But I mean, let's go over the things where markets go wrong, because what you were talking about, Ryan, is all those kind of conservative arguments. And what's it is Carrington's fence or something, is you don't remove a fence until you know what it's there for. And Adam Smith's arguments for the invisible hand was he was kind of saying the same thing as kind of laissez-faire capitalism works and intervention doesn't. So those are half-truths in my view, and I think we should go over them as why markets fail. And spoiler is that the capitalist system was a big feedback loop. So it's Adam Smith's thing doesn't really work because it leads to freeloading and so that defeats itself. So I would say they're parasites and symbiotes, but they're not in a stable relationship. They oscillate, and that it is actually a chaotic relationship. So that would probably be a good thing to go over in the next one. And then all right, well let's round it off there because we've got 2 hours, and that's probably good enough for one Sunday. So let's just pause, relax, and just come to a point of intelligence. There we go. All right, everybody, that was another cool conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Be safe out there.
Bye.
You too. Must be early in the morning for you.
Yep, I'm up late.